First, I'd like to closing speaker. So I'd like to remind the audience what the title of today's program is, which is Terrorism in the Youth of Africa, a Threat to International Peace and Security. And what struck me most today was something that the professor said, that in the morning session, that the problem all emanates from the Middle East, which I think is true. I can recall one situation where I had to discuss, where it's relevant to children soldiers, I guess. A situation where an Israeli soldier had to shoot and kill maybe a 12-year-old because his unit had to go from here to here, and on that hill was a machine gunner, and when they looked through the binoculars, they saw that the shooter was about 12, and behind him was his mother encouraging him on. So he was the machine gunner of his unit, and he's the one who had to take out the kid. So he did it, and didn't feel so good about it afterwards, but he had to do it. You go a little east to the Taliban in Afghanistan. You won't find these videos on YouTube, but there are a good number of Taliban beheading videos circulating. And one in particular that I have is about 6 minutes. And when they behead, they mean behead. Just slitting the throat and killing someone is easy. That doesn't take too much effort. But to behead, you have to chop the bone in half. And there was a 6-minute video of a kid. Maybe the kids were hooded. Maybe the kid was 12 years old, and got a few friends watching and encouraging him, and the adults were encouraging him. And this poor kid was able to cut the throat, which is not that hard, but he didn't have the strength to actually behead. So he was chopping and pulling and twisting and chopping. And that was pretty disgusting. Even talking about it doesn't sound all that pleasant, and watching it is. And then you wonder, how do they get 12-year-old kids to do this? And actually, all right, so you can't separate the head from the body, but he spent a lot of time pulling and chopping and twisting, and his friends are all excited, hoping he can get it done. And you wonder how they get this done. I don't have an answer right now, but what I'd like to focus on is the question that has been raised: what do we do in order to preclude these kids from being influenced into radicalism? And now, Nigeria, we know, is the Nigeria, for example, is the 7th largest country in the world by population. 65% under the age of 25, I think. I read that Nigeria has 100 universities, 500,000 students a year apply, only 150,000 a year are accepted. So we're talking about millions of kids who are not being influenced by these radicals, which is something we shouldn't forget. It's not as if we have, tens of millions of kids being influenced by radicals. So a couple of thousand here and there in a number of countries is bad enough. But so I'd like to focus on one aspect of making sure these kids are radicalized, because Africa is a fertile ground, as we said before, and it's to go after the people who are radicalizing them. So going after the kids, that's after the fact, making sure that they're not affected by them. Sometimes is after the fact. Before the fact, it makes more sense logically to go after those who are trying to radicalize them. So what I would like to go over is some material showing what's motivating the people who are doing the radicalization of these kids. or of adults, for that matter, but the emphasis now is on kids, on youth. And I'm going to do it from two sides. First, just one document on what they are thinking of in terms of their own ideological motivation, and then I want to emphasize the point that actually most people, those who are engaged in terrorism and other armed conflict, for the most part, everybody believes that they're on the defensive. Everybody believes that they're the ones defending themselves. Those who did 9/11 are convinced, which I don't want to get into too many details now, but they're convinced that they're protecting the world from the threat that we pose to them. And I'll speak about that briefly. But they were on the defensive when they were doing that. They weren't on the offensive, which is what it appears to us. But here I have an article, a 4-page article, from 1977 from an Islamic magazine. It's in English, it's on the internet nowadays, refuting misconceptions. And the title of the article is The Islamic Legitimacy of the Martyrdom Operation. And it's 4 pages of analysis on why these martyrdom operations are legitimate, and conclusion. After 4 pages of analysis, the conclusion is, though the above evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah is clearly demonstrated that the Islamic bombing assault and the martyrdom attack is Islamically legitimate as far as it is within the framework of Islam. All right? Now, in those days, Africa wasn't on the forefront of these problems. It was still the Middle East. I know, for example, I think Cecilia spoke about the work that her organization does, the Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee. I think it's fair to say that if that committee had never existed, there'd be more terrorism today, not less terrorism. At the same time, all dialogue and so forth is not a panacea. It will work with people, despite the tautology. It will work with people with whom it will work. It will not work with people with whom it won't work. And not everybody's going to sit down for a dialogue. And it's not going to work with Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. It could work with lots of people who are possibly recruitable or other groups, but with certain groups it's not going to work. Now, I have here a quote from the New York Times magazine in August, New York Times editorial in August 2002. It's not about Africa, it was right after 9/11. So the title of the op-ed piece was The Anger of Arab Youth. And the New York Times writes, throughout the Arab world, millions of young people resent America and the West. As a first step, Washington needs to become more convincing and consistent advocate of advocacy in the Arab world. Now, that may or may not be true. It may be a good idea that the way to deal with the growing resentment of Arab youth is to promote democracy. But what the New York Times doesn't understand is that by promoting democracy, at the same time they want to promote democracy in the Arab world to stop terrorism and radicalism on one hand, that's a call to war for others in the Arab world, because to them that is an assault on the way they believe the world should be run, which is according to the will of Allah. And by promoting democracy, democracy is not the way Allah wants the world to run. Liberty, democracy, that is not, they are protecting the world that Allah created from our Western assault on how global affairs should be run. United States Declaration of Independence, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Every American knows this. that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So everybody knows that the Declaration of Independence says self-evident, life, liberty, and the self-evident truths, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but people don't realize that where do these rights come from? Not from natural law. We are endowed by our Creator. So here we are, America, telling the world that God has given the world, the people, the right to life, liberty, and happiness, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, under Taliban rule, you couldn't whistle in the street, because if you're whistling, you were not focusing on Allah. You were having a good time. That's why when the Taliban rule, you couldn't buy music and DVDs, and now today you can. Which only means the Taliban was correct, that if the West wins, then their way of life will be under attack. Every American knows this also. Right? Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the success of liberty. Every American knows what that is. That's JFK's inaugural address in 1961. Support any friend, oppose any foe. That sounds just like George Bush after 9/11. You're either with us or without us. But what's JFK talking about? He's talking about the survival and success of liberty. Right? My fellow citizens of the world, and I ask not what you can do. My fellow Americans, ask not what you can do for your country. And this is, my fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what you together can do for the freedom of man. JFK is calling for liberty and freedom. That's an attack on those who are trying to recruit African youth into terrorist groups. And to make it even worse, what does JFK say? Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking is His blessing and His help. Who's His? Capital H, God. But knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. So not only is JFK talking about life, liberty, and freedom, he's saying that this is God telling us that we're supposed to promote life and freedom and liberty among the nations of the world. This is God saying. And then we think Al-Qaeda and related groups are simply trying to attack us, to kill us for the fun of it. They're protecting themselves against our assault on the way they believe the world ought to be run. And George Bush said the same thing in State of the Union addresses. Americans are a free people, and we know freedom is the right of every person and the future of every nation. Freedom is the right of every person and the future of every nation. The liberty we prize is not America's gifts to the world, it is God's gifts to humanity. So here we have George Bush and JFK, 40 years apart, the liberal, Democrat, conservative, Republican, saying that America promoting life and freedom, liberty and freedom across the world is our duty given to us by God. And then how could you say that Al-Qaeda isn't right? Al-Qaeda is correct. They're defending what they believe, how they believe the world ought to run, against how we believe the world ought to run. And then, one final thing I want to bring up. 1999, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, today called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, passed a resolution or convention of combating terrorism. And as we all know, that the people's struggle against foreign occupation and so forth is just a euphemism for terrorism, and we all know that. Article 1, terrorism means any act of violence notwithstanding its motive or intention perpetrated to carry out on an individual with the aim of terrorizing people or threatening harm to them or imperiling their lives. That's beautiful. I couldn't have written a better definition of terrorism myself. Except Article 2. People struggle, including armed struggle against foreign occupation, aggression, colonialism, aimed at liberation and self-determination, shall not be considered a terrorism crime. So what's the point of Article 1 if you have Article 2? Article 1 says whoever, for whatever reason, wherever, irrespective of motives. But Article 2 says if you're doing it to liberate on foreign occupation, that's not terrorism. Somehow, global strategy that was mentioned before, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2006. You know, the way these General Assembly resolutions read, you can read pages of reaffirming and recalling and reiterating and all sorts of things until you finally get to what the resolution is talking about. We therefore adopt a global strategy on terrorism. United Nations. Somehow, the wording of the OIC Convention in 1999 crept into the United Nations resolution in 2006, reiterating its strong condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations committed by whoever and for whatever purpose. That's pretty strong. Well, what exception could there be to that? 3 paragraphs later, recalling that in the 2000 World Summit on Terrorism, world leaders rededicated themselves to uphold the right of self-determination of future people which remain under colonial domination or foreign occupation, which means terrorism. So what do you do? So here we see that a couple of points. Number one, how people managed to get 12-year-olds to stand with a machine gun and shoot, with the kid's mother encouraging him, I don't know, but second-hand experience. I spoke to the soldier who had to take out the kid, and these things happen. And 20 years ago, maybe, well, it did happen in Africa 20 years ago, but it's getting worse. And number 2, we see that the proponents of Islamic terrorism have their sources to support what they're doing. But by the same token, they're also on the defensive because we have our sources talking about God wanting the West, or wanting America to promote liberty and freedom throughout the world, which is an assault on Al-Qaeda and groups who think like Al-Qaeda. Number 3. We see that somehow the OIC says that terrorism committed by anyone for whatever the reason is no good, except if you're doing it for the purpose of fighting colonialism and foreign occupation. That's not considered terrorism. 6 years later, the same language is in the United Nations resolution. So the answer to that is politics, which is too much to get into now. So if the topic of today's event is the threat to African youth and its repercussions on international security, I submit that we have a lot of work ahead of ourselves to figure out how to deal with this problem.